And we are live with our 53rd episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Welcome once again. This is episode 53. So we're excited to have everyone back. We're especially excited to have Greg on the show. Had a lot of good activity the last week or so, right? We had Chris on last week with a great podcast. We did veer a little ways off the technical topics last week, but I think it was appreciated by a lot of us, even me and Ken, especially just to talk about work-life balance and how to stay sane in the industry. So if you didn't listen to that episode, be sure to go back either on absoluteappsec.com or on our YouTube channel and find it. Chris is always full of good advice. So outside of that, we've got training coming up in Tel Aviv at AppSec Global. The event there at the end of May. We'll be doing Seth and Ken's Excellent Adventures in Secure Code Review. Once again, teach you how, the stuff that we do when we're conducting a code review. So that's our plug for this week. If you're going to be there, consider it. If you haven't taken the course before, it's a lot of fun for us to actually talk about that stuff. So outside of that, I think we've got the AppSec Minute today. We're on number 5 of the top 10 web hacking techniques, if I can talk this week. And as usual, Ken's the one that did the research there because I can't seem to get my shit together some days, but it is what it is.
And this is before we get into, because I'm really excited today because we have on Greg Ose from GitHub Security, from GitHub. He's my boss. I always like saying that.
I feel like you had to do that, disclaimer there.
I have to.
Yeah. So what? He twisted your arm. He's like, Ken, you're doing this podcast.
I've been asking Greg.
So
yeah, you sync up performance reviews with. No, I've actually been asking Greg to come on for a long time because we've had so many people ask us about like how to build an AppSec program. Like that's the number one thing that seems to always crop up. And it always seems to be a situation where it's people who are like maybe themselves and one other person, sometimes just themselves, and they're going to be able to hire some folks or sometimes they can hire someone or they can spend money on tools. There's always these different situations. So I think it's going to be a really helpful one. We're going to pick your brain. There's a lot you've done right, Greg, and I'm really excited to dig into it. Before we do that, I guess we will get into number 5 of the Portswigger top 10 2018 list of hacking techniques. It's a mouthful. So this one is, I believe it's Franz Rosen, I want to say is the name. And the two things we'll touch on, because it's modern web hacking techniques is basically the title talk. But what it really is using, like, for instance, app cache with HTML5. And then separately, there's also a section in the talk on using post message to attack sites. So let's start with the app cache portion. It's an HTML5 feature. This was in 2017. This is just so everyone knows this has been fixed in all 4 of the major browsers. But at the time, basically what they found was app cache allows you to, using an XML file, specify a fallback URL. So let's say you visited a site and there's an XML file uploaded that an attacker controlled. They could set a fallback URL. So this means if you visited anywhere else on that same site and triggered like a 500 internal server error, then your browser would fall back to making a request off to whatever in that fallback in the app cache. So what they found was because with XML, you can also render HTML. So if you can craft the cookies to be like these huge, large bits of data in the cookies, like it basically is cookie stuffing. You just make a ton of data inside, we have these overly long cookies. When you make a request off to a site with that, it causes the 500. So you use those two things in tandem. You have a fallback URL to the attacker site, and you have cookies stuffing to cause the 500 request, so the browser reverts to that fallback. So that's the gist of the attack in a nutshell. But then what they actually showed in terms of practical attack was, this was on Dropbox. They were awarded like a 12,500 or 12,800 or something like that bounty amount for this. And what they found was they could host this XML file up on Dropbox. They could do the cookie stuffing so that there would be a 500 error. They could set the fallback URL. And so once you've visited that site or visited that XML file, and let's say you go to like click on the next thing you do is you try to click on download for a file, like a sensitive file, like a signed URL, and that is the only protection for that file. It's like that unique signed URL. What would happen is you would trigger 500 on Dropbox. You would send off your request to the fallback URL. And I believe it was in the refer or something along those lines where it would show the URL of the sensitive file, the long signed unique URL to the attacker's logs. So they actually showed that in the video. So that was kind of the practical attack of the first piece there. The second piece was post message, and like I think Greg, you had mentioned it. Like pretty much my knowledge of post message comes from this link, which I'll put in the chat, which is, essentially post message is used for CORS, for being able to make requests off to, like, let's say I want to call a function on a remote site. I can do that with post messages, not a problem. What you're supposed to do on if you're receiving the post messages, you're supposed to check the origin, right? Like, we don't want to just allow any site to invoke functions on our site. And we want to check the origin and make sure that it matches up with our expectations. And from a practical attack standpoint, the gist of that was there was some broken regular expression in one of these post message, or one of these sites that's receiving the post message. It didn't check origin correctly. And then essentially you're able to invoke some functions that ran your JavaScript code. So you could do your typical alert, like document.cookie or document.domain or whatever, as a proof of concept. So that's basically, like, in a nutshell, what was discussed with post message. So that's kind of the AppSec few minutes, the AppSec minute. The
AppSec rambling, is that what we should change it to?
Yeah, I know. I feel like that scene in what was it, Happy or Billy Madison, where he's like, "We are all now dumber for having listened to you."
No, not at all. I like that. That was one that I hadn't dug into. I dig the whole app cache, 500 error / I mean, it makes sense, right? And so, like, exploiting the two of them is kind of unique, so it's cool. I definitely think the list is still good, right? What's coming out of Portswigger there. I know we had the other one that went this week, the XSS stuff that was posted yesterday. It was in the Slack channels that we were talking about. Ken, the video that misfire that Jason and I can't remember who else were posting. Neil, we're talking about, right? That one's pretty interesting too. And maybe we'll leave that until next week, because that is, like, the whole context and how the parsers work inside the browser is pretty interesting. But it probably will take a little bit more than just, hey, it's reflected user input, right? Anyway, so that brings us to Greg, right? And all credit to Greg, right? I give Ken and Jason and everybody and Neil, everybody crap that they work at this AppSec Wonderland over at GitHub. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Yeah, I've heard murmurs of
you've heard murmurs of that.
I don't know where it comes
from. It's strictly jealousy and envy. So just, it's fine, right? Like, most of the places I walk into, I'm like, oh, ProdSec, you get to analyze, here's 3 people and you get to analyze 400 applications every year. Yeah. And they're all high priority, and you, basically you have no life. So anyway, yeah, I'll credit you building the organization out over there. But, first thing we always want to do is kind of get background, right? Sure. So where you started, what brought you into application security, and how you ended up where you're at.
Yeah, I think so. I went to school. I got a bachelor's in computer science, and even in my kind of bachelor program, I went to Purdue University, and part of there they have a kind of a research, mostly for graduate degrees and things. But Sirius is CERIAS. I forgot how to spell it, but it's a center kind of focused on security research, and this was when was I in college? Back in early 2000. So I was able to kind of structure some of my work outside of coursework, kind of focused on security. Did some interesting stuff there, and then also worked for the campus IT department doing security work as well. So I was kind of already able to find a little bit focus on security through that research, and then through the IT job doing security, did some vulnerability scanning things. So kind of got, even without, besides a single course in, computer security, got a little bit of exposure even during college. And I think, curriculums nowadays, I actually taught a graduate course at DePaul focused on application security assessment. Taught that for a couple of years. And it's kind of cool to see curriculums being offering more focused, this is not just like, here's your one security course, all of computer science, and we're going to cover, everything from IT security to cryptography to maybe talk about SQL injection, maybe really focus on those buffer overflows, because that's what we all spend our days looking at, I'm sure. But it's cool to see more kind of modern curriculums, coming out around security too. But that said, background wise, I got a little bit of experience there, but never really thought of it as, a career path, as this is something, I would definitely want to focus on security or not. So my first job out of college was working at Motorola in Champaign, Illinois. And there I worked on pre-Android Linux phones. So if you haven't heard of them, it's not surprising.
Did those exist, right?
It had like a cool name. It was like the Moto Riser Z6. It ran Linux. It was legitimately running Linux. So this was Motorola's attempt to get off of their old crusty mobile phone platform that they'd used for things like the Razor and everything, and move to something more modern. So it was kind of getting thrown into that was pretty interesting. It was, kernel development and all this. And I started the team, started on the team my first day, and they're like, oh, I see you did some security work. So we have these new requirements to implement like kernel level access control around these DRM keys. I was like, okay, like this is all new to me. So it was kind of an interesting, again, I don't want to say by chance, but just given my previous experience, really, again, focusing my work towards, security. And that was kind of, some interesting work there. Was only there for a few years until they closed the entire design center in Champaign. And then I was like, it's kind of, the whole campus got laid off, and I was like, okay, what am I going to do now? And, I kind of realized I really liked that, that security aspect. It's something I'd had a few years to kind of focus on. And I think at some point in a career, and kind of coming out of computer science, maybe not completely, a split, but you have to kind of say, like, do I really want to focus on kind of the security side of it, or do I want to just, there's always a little bit of both. But I think like my focus is like, okay, I want to really kind of dive into the security, application security, not do, another, strictly software engineering position, but get into security. And that's when I started interviewing for a few different jobs, and ended up with a job up in Chicago for a consulting company called Neo-Hapsis. If the name rings familiar, I think the most public, I'd take that back. There's lots of claims to fame, but they ran a mirror of like a full disclosure and different security mailing lists for the longest of time. Neo-Hapsis.com. So it was the So if you've seen the logo or heard the name, but maybe not have heard of the actual consulting company, that was the company I worked for, and I worked there for For about 3 years, a little over 3 years. And that's really where I learned, everything about application security. So that's kind of your traditional security consulting, taking, off the deep end of, what's the engagement, this week, and what do I need to be an expert on by Monday so I can walk into a building and be the expert, or at least seem like the expert until I can go back to my hotel room and, really figure out what I'm talking about. So that was the,
we've talked about this, by the way, on the podcast. As a consultant, this is so common.
Yeah, it's definitely one way to really get your bearings. And there was a lot of really smart people who were working there, and were great mentors. And I really learned a lot, from web application security to reverse engineering. Just kind of anything sales could sell is what I was learning. So it was a really cool opportunity to learn all of that, and it was a really good 3 years. I think that also being in a consulting role, I think there's there's more pressure, I think, to do research and to present and do all of that. So it really kind of pushed me to get out there and do research and, just kind of absorb the world of computer security and application security and network security, at that, that current period of time, 2007 to 2010, kind of focusing on what the world of security had to offer. And then, I kind of hit my wall with consulting and traveling and all of that. And, after, I had my first kid on the way, and I was like, not having to travel for consulting, still being able to do security sounds like a good option. So started looking at places where I could work in-house and work for a security team in-house at a company, and really trying to stay focused on application security. And I ended up getting a job at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, so CME Group in Chicago, so financial industry. And this is you mentioned a little bit, the typical, rolling in. Here's our 400 apps. We've have a AppSec team. We have a general security team, right? Some people that have focused on AppSec. But really, it was like, how do you even start scratching the surface with some of that, legacy technical debt everywhere? So it was another, kind of a different twist on it. Was really kind of the seeing what it. I think in consulting too, there's it's great. You get to find vulnerabilities, learn stuff, but depending on the engagement, right? It's kind of the end of it. You don't really get to see things through, and this was kind of my option to see, like, okay, we all know there's problems. I'm gonna, help find those problems, but also help find solutions and help, the teams really understand what needs to be done and help them do that work. And so that was, I think I was at CME for a year or two. I guess I'm looking at my resume now. I got LinkedIn up, so I'm cheating. I can never remember dates. I'm like, when did I graduate college? So I was there for a little over almost 3 years. Working on that. So as part of that, just a lot of Java apps. XXE was my bread and butter. It was like anytime like a new app, like it was like, it was a financial industry. So everything was either fixed fast or it was XML, and it was all Java, and Java out of the box was like, sure, go ahead and I'll load remote files from anywhere. So I'll execute that as Java code, of course. Why wouldn't I? I'm an XML parser. So I think a lot of that was, it was interesting to see more of, which I think you don't get too much in consulting, is just the I don't want to say kind of just how teams work and how priorities work and the bureaucracy, not in a bad way, but any company, right, kind of has, teams have their prioritization and they have their reporting structure and they have their goals. And, sometimes security doesn't, is kind of an unexpected curveball, of like, oh, now we have all these vulnerabilities. Let's get these fixed. And I think everyone wants to do the right thing. It's just a matter of prioritizing what that work means versus, other risks of not getting development work done. And, a lot of times like, well, we'll have to shut down our trading platform if we don't implement this feature by this date. I'm like, all right, you win. You get prior, like internal cross-site scripting can wait. Like that sounds more important. But it's like kind of navigating those waters and seeing, there's, how do you, as someone whose kind of sole focus is on security, right? And I think that's I don't know. I like to think a lot of what I do and AppSec in general is just like glorified QA, right? Like we like to call it cool stuff, but really we're just sitting down.
Yeah.
We're doing testing. We're making developers more comfortable with the products, with the features they're shipping, right? But really, we just have chosen to focus on security and become, subject matter experts in that area. And it's like, where does that work really? Where does that fit into? In the case of CME, a very large engineering organization that already has all of its structure and, it was very, very mature. I think, they've been doing technology for a long time, and that, a lot of their development workflows and everything were pretty well matured, but there was never, a specific AppSec, it was just like kind of the security team off to the side. And so it was really, really an interesting experience. Got more exposure to sitting down doing assessment work. Wrote. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people in this space who have been at multiple companies at some point in time have written a report generator where you put your security vulnerabilities in it and it generates a report. Like I swear I've written 3 of them. Luckily now at GitHub, like we have GitHub to do this for us. But it's like I wrote another report generator and it generated PDFs with some charts of risks and matrices of findings. So I wrote one.
That's every consulting firm has that on their backlog somewhere, right? They either have it like somewhat implemented, or you're absolutely right. Or internally, or
the problem
at
consulting orgs though is like once you implement it internally, they're like, how do we sell this and turn this into a product? I'm like, you don't. It's going to fall over if I do one more thing to it. It gets the reports generated in enough time for the customers. Please do not try to turn this into a product.
But integrate it with Okta. Come on, it works just fine.
Yeah, no, it's like how we're going to write a GRC platform, and can this tool? I'm like, no, this just generates PDFs and maybe reports things out to Jira. That's what I was doing at the time. Nice. So yeah,
I was just gonna say, like the whole like QA, that's one thing I love to harp on is the fact that we're glorified QA testers, and most of us do it very poorly compared to how the QA team actually reports vulnerabilities and does coverage and generates graphs of, hey, this is everything that we tested, this is where we found vulnerabilities, In security, we have a tendency to generate a PDF that has one finding in it, and that represents like 1,000 hours or whatever, right? Like worth of like testing and all these test cases. And we didn't document any of that, right?
Right. Yeah. So, we get to feel special though because we do non-functional testing. Right.
There you go. It's integration testing.
Our discretion. It's like, I looked at it for a few hours, and this is the result. Like, consider that coverage.
Yeah.
I remember doing consulting once. I forget, it was for a large industrial company, and they're contracting us to do an application assessment, and they're like, okay, so like we're gonna need your test matrix of all the bacteria tests, and we're like, oh, I'll send you my it wasn't Burpet, I'll send you my Paros proxy logs. Like, does that count as my test cases? And they're like, sure. I was like, okay.
And they accepted it. I had one of those just recently, right, where they're like, hey, we need to know all the tests that you're going to be running. I'm like, I haven't even logged into the application yet. I'm like, no, this is the answer that you get from me. Can you give me your unit test cases? And they're like, well, we haven't developed those yet. And I'm like, there we go. Right.
Nice try.
Nice try. I'm not going to
engagement, right?
Yeah. I'm like, sure, I can get you those, but that's going to cost you another like 30 hours worth of work for me to develop that all. So
just send them a screen recording of you testing and Googling.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. That's going to be super interesting.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, fine. So I was at CME for almost 3 years, and then one of my friends, actually someone who I taught that at our DePaul assessment course, Ben Tays, went over to GitHub, and he was kind of their first application security hire. So he had worked at NeoHapsis after I had left NeoHapsis, but really bright guy. And he went over there as their first AppSec hire, and then they were looking to build out the team. So he reached out to me, and I was like, okay, well, this is, CME was pretty comfy and cozy. And it was, we're making good progress, but the allure of, I guess, the GitHub at the time very much was, this is back to kind of like the bare bones, kind of the groundwork of, building out this company. When I started, GitHub was in its phase of, we don't have a management structure, they're kind of known for that, and, just presenting across the community. And, it was a really exciting place to kind of come in and kind of start, see what the landscape was like there and see where we could guide it. So I started there. Let's see, I look back at LinkedIn in July 2013. So almost 6 years now. It's coming up close on 6 years. And again, it was myself and Ben as kind of the two hires focused in application security. And then there was Sean, who's still my boss. I guess he wasn't my boss at the time because there was no management, kind of leading security globally, and then another employee focused on incident response. And that was the extent of the security team at GitHub at the time. And so even then it was kind of cool to say, like, okay, we have a security team of 4 people and 2 of those people are application security, focused on application security. And then a longtime friend, actually someone who I worked with at Motorola, kind of tangentially, I was doing development work, and my friend Patrick Toomey was on the actual security team doing assessment of the work I was doing. So I was in Bloomington, and he came down from like Chicago as like their security assessment team. So I was the one at that point being like under the security review microscope. It's funny. I worked with him at NeoHapsys, and then he ended up joining GitHub as well. A few months after I did, maybe like 5 or 6 months after I did. So there we were, again, a security team of 5 people now, with 3 people focused on AppSec. So I think maybe that was maybe a sign of okay, this is, I think a lot of times, right? I would say our responsibilities spanned a lot broader than what we've been able to focus on. There was still a lot of operational security and all of that, the responsibilities, but we all had that background specifically of application security. So in the early days of my time at GitHub, it really was assessment work and architectural changes to say, like, okay, we have these 6 different ways that we are authenticating, outside of stateless authentication across the app. Let's sit down, think of best practices, and do the engineering work to rip all of that out and replace it with, a standardized method of authentication that we feel comfortable with, and that we feel like will provide an API that won't be messed up during developers, a well-documented API to create, to do stateless authentication. And we're able to do that. We were able to sit down at the time, it was mostly just, a monolithic app that ran all of GitHub and was written in Ruby on Rails. And if we wanted to do something like, replace all authentication tokens, we did it. And we sat down and did that project. And then a lot of other kind of just architectural changes to help, make the app more securable in the future. And other things too. I think before I started there, GitHub rolled out content security policy, and so after I was there, it was just a matter of, at that time, content security policy in the spec. I mean, even today, it's still in flux, right? So as the spec was changing and introducing new things, updating our policy to be in line with that, or to enforce as much as we possibly could in that policy. So yeah, a lot of both doing assessment work of new features and of new services, and also doing a lot of that architectural security work. So refactoring all of our authentication flows so they all log the same way, and just all sorts of just trying to wrangle where the app was at that point in time, to have better APIs and be easier to work with without introducing security vulnerabilities.
Yeah,
I
that's
did just
interesting.
post the link to the CSP post.
Oh,
The GitHub's post CSP journey article.
Yeah, I think there's I don't know. You got if you search GitHub and CSP now, CSP is too popular. So 2013, Josh Peak actually did the original blog post. So 2013 was when GitHub, before I was there, actually rolled out CSP. So that's pretty interesting. I forgot what the policy was. At least I had a defined script source. So it's probably matured since then, but it's kind of cool to see, it's been in place since 2013. And by having that in place, right, and it buys you a lot from, it's much harder to make, to make concessions when you have to make a policy more permissive than wanting to make it more restrictive for something that's already in place. It's a little easier to say like, oh, we don't want to introduce this risk instead of we really want to disable this functionality so we can decrease our risk. So it's having that foundation early on, it was really helpful, at least around, CSP and things like that, and kind of our posture on, how our JavaScript gets sourced in and things like that.
Yeah. When you started building the program, I mean, was it more focused on application assessments, or was it more like, oh, we need to shore up? Because I mean, when I say shore up architecture, what I mean is you talked about adding CSP, but also they're, like having files hosted through the render app, for instance, like those types of changes, were those more of a focus, or was it a mix of the two?
Yeah, it was all over. I would say it was, a pretty solid mix between assessment work and product features. I mean, there was a big push for, when we launched, I forget what version of GitHub Enterprise, but re-architecting GitHub Enterprise. So traditionally, we always had this issue in GitHub Enterprise where legacy versions of GitHub Enterprise where, the content you hosted on gist was on the same domain as, the main GitHub app. So GitHub Enterprise is, I think we now call it GitHub Enterprise Server, is kind of our on-prem version of GitHub. So the early versions had this architectural issue, right? Where, if you had cross-site, if you you ran GitHub pages on your enterprise instance, obviously you can run JavaScript and, it's like cross-site scripting as a feature if that's on the same domain. So we did a lot of architectural work to extract out those subdomains from the main app and have some of this is how we protect ourselves in production. You run GitHub pages and it's on github.io. You upload a file or you download a file from a Git repository through the Webflow, and it goes through GitHub user content. So that was like kind of one of the big architecture changes, right? It's like, let's start isolating all of this user content from our main authenticated domain, github.com. And so again, that's like another one of those architectural changes that I think we implemented at that time. Just, we kind of, instead of trying to constantly fight how is the browser going to interpret this, raw content file? Is it going to, do some content sniffing and, execute JavaScript from it? It's like having that on a domain that's isolated from where our authentication lives was, kind of a cool area where we could add more defense in depth, even if we did everything we could to, properly escape things or force downloads on, file downloads and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that like that isolation and CSP, people talk a lot about, when we talk about XSS, like the difficulty in, like it's easy to introduce without buggy browser behavior, but then it's kind of like you touched on it for a second there, which is browser from one release from standard that's been updated to the next can behave completely like different. There are little nuanced things that get introduced. Like you could be doing pretty much everything right, but then there's like some weird behavior that somebody uncovers, and then you're like, crap, now you've got to worry about that. But if you have like if you've got CSP and you've got some isolation, you've bought yourself architecturally some some protections against that stuff. If you had to go back from the beginning, like, would you choose one over the other? Would you be like, look, before we do assessments, I just want to like dig right into like, where can we improve architecturally, or would you do something else? Would you implement training to begin with? Would you contract out to vendors? Like, what is there anything you would have, knowing what you know now, go back and, say your first 6 months would have done maybe differently? Or,
No, I think it was actually kind of important that we were doing both at the same time. I think a lot of the architectural changes, right? Or, we ran across and said like, oh, we have these 10 different authentication tokens, right? That was kind of the result of us sitting down being like, oh, hey, I found a vulnerability in that authentication token. How do we prevent, this in the future? So it's really kind of the vulnerabilities identified during that assessment work really help drive, I think, a lot of that, the development work and the engineering work to say, okay, well, we've done X number of assessments and we found issues with people, using, raw in their ERB templates to output things unescaped because they think that they're, correctly, they're just either throwing around raw, not really knowing what it does, or marking things as HTML safe when they're not actually. So it's like, what's the best thing we can do in these cases, right? And that was the situation of sitting down and removing all of our calls to raw, actually using the correct APIs to build out the DOM and things like that in ERB and in Ruby on Rails, and then saying, okay, raw is no longer allowed. There should never be a case where you are directly bypassing any sort of output escaping or encoding. And but it was the identification of vulnerabilities that really led to, okay, this is a pain point and we should focus here. Or there's been a lot of vulnerabilities introduced, around, say OAuth flow, but I don't want to get into that. Yeah, but
nobody does.
Browsers behaving in unintended ways, right? It's very much URL parsing between server-side libraries and client libraries. That could be, it's like, well, how do we architecturally get rid of that? Unfortunately, that one's still a tricky point. So I think it really is the assessment work either drives or helps reinforce, the architectural development work, and saying, where should we focus our time and features? And I don't think I would do it differently. I think that, at that time at GitHub as well. And I think something that's changed, right, is I came in, as, with, 5-6 years of AppSec experience at that point in time. And I was still I was new to Ruby on Rails. There were a lot of people at the company who, core Ruby on Rails contributors who knew the framework and everything. And there was a lot of, where I could say, okay, cool. Like, I'm going to do my best to apply the knowledge that I have in application security. But as far as writing secure code for new features, I'm going to lean a lot on the developers. I'll try to ask the right questions. I'll try to, I guess, just make sure that everyone's aware more informally than a training program, right? But through assessments and things like that, kind of bring awareness to certain vulnerabilities or certain areas to be careful at. But, the developers were kind of and still today, I think, like, the developers are the experts on writing the code, right? Writing the code in a correct way, right? I think where a lot of AppSec comes in is to making it clear and being the experts on what that means from a security perspective. What does it mean to write secure code? Like, what certain things need to be considered for, certain decisions when writing code. And I think even early on, that was kind of I'm not going to be able to, assess everything. So I'm going to rely a lot on the developers and figure out the best, groups of vulnerabilities maybe to look for across the code base. And then from that, developing some of the product and internal, development work across the app.
Well, that kind of brings us.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that that comes into play. Like Omer had a question, right? He was on the show a little while ago around security champions. And first of all, he wondered if you did have like some sort of a security champions program. I don't know if it's that formal for you guys. Like, I don't think we've ever really talked about that. But the other thing you wanted to know is how do you go about encouraging devs to participate in that sort of a situation, right? Yeah. What is their responsibility, and what do you do to encourage it?
Yeah, so we don't have. I mean, it's. I'm sure there is a GitHub issue in the AppSec repo at GitHub about security champions that's at least 4 years old plus, about this idea of having a more formalized definition around what someone in the engineering organization that takes on some amount of similar threat modeling or just kind of AppSec knowledge and responsibility. And we don't have a program at this time. It's something where we're still tracking. We still see kind of the need. There's been no reason why it hasn't been done, just because, besides everything, all the other work. I think with infinite time and resources, I think there would be something, a formal program where we can offer guidance, because we see it informally, I think, a lot. Right, we see certain developers across the organization that we know they kind of know the sort of reviews we do. They know the areas where we're kind of experts in, and know the right time to reach out, I think. And I think also part of that, they understand, the process of doing a threat model and worrying about kind of these, non-functional test cases, if you will, these, negative test cases of it shouldn't do this. So that they instead of just looking at how the feature should be implemented, can look at it and say, okay, well, what sort of things do I need to be careful about or avoid? And I think we get that in the organization just through how we do, I think, assessments at this point. Reaching out to teams, working with teams to do very specific AppSec reviews on new features that are shipping and things like that. And that's a conversation, meeting with our team and with the developers to do threat modeling, and then through that, right, you're building up those. I don't think the developers don't leave those meetings without ever thinking about kind of that threat model or the risks discussed and things like that. So there's a lot of knowledge sharing, I think, that goes in to those meetings, but it's by no means a formal security champions program. There's just engineers across the organization that constantly reach out, or that we've worked with in the past through AppSec reviews, maybe to work through specific vulnerability or things like that, where the next time around we've built that relationship, we've had those interactions, and they're aware of the right questions to ask, and if they don't know the answers, to reach out to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's crucial, right? Any security program is those relationships are really what drives it all. And the good ones, that's where I see it actually happen, is the developer. I mean, no developer wants their code to be the culprit for getting hacked, right? They don't, right? It's too public at this point, and even if they don't get fired over it, it's just a huge knock to their craft. So and
it just I think it just boils down to the fact of just awareness, right, and kind of understanding what the AppSec team can offer versus what they don't offer, or what they or what developers can kind of work through on their own. And I think that's kind of a tricky balance, especially now at GitHub at its current size, right? We have so many changes and features being shipped. It's what does our role really become? Our role isn't reviewing every piece of code as it goes out the door. Ideally before it goes out the door, I guess. But there's just not, now and I guess maybe to go back for a little context of how the teams have grown. But so I had mentioned Ben and Patrick and myself kind of starting out, AppSec at GitHub. And then there was a point in time when we realized, okay, this product development work, this, developing security features is a completely different kind of workflow than doing assessment work. And at this point we had kicked off, I already started the bug bounty program. So we're getting vulnerability reports and doing triage on that, and third-party assessments and things like that. So kind of have all these various sources of vulnerabilities coming in, code review still going on, right? And then actually trying to scope out, well, I actually need to sit down and do this development work, right? That's like completely different scoping and workflow and kind of structure of that job, whereas the security work is very interrupt driven, I would say. Ideally, development work is not interrupt driven, right? So we took the path for the team to kind of split it, and this is where we are now. We have a ProdSec team, which is led by Patrick. Ben's on that team, and they have more people on that team now, really focused on the development work. So developing either, be it new features, implementing new browser security features, spinning up new services that provide an architecture for developers to do security things, correctly. Like we have a service to do, encryption, and developers never have to touch that. And we provide APIs. So it's, kind of all those kind of tricky things that we don't want developers working on, but want to provide them good libraries or good architecture to use it. They've been focused on that work. So, and then same thing with user-facing features. So features like, your token alerts. If you, commit a GitHub token and it gets revoked, and then we automatically revoke it, and kind of all those features of, kind of spanning the range of architectural security and user security, and really making, focusing on that as an engineering team. So it's an engineering team that still lives under the security org, but they're very focused on kind of product features or internal architecture kind of changes. And then AppSec is all of the kind of assessment work. And that's the team I lead. That's the team that Ken's on. And again, focused on kind of everything else, right? It's bug bounty program triage. We run, I think also one of the things that we started kind of early days, but have continued running, automation, right? What automation can we do to help supplement our manual review? Is there some amount of automated assessment we can do to allow us to at least have an indicator that this is code we want to dig deeper into? And that's been kind of important kind of side. So we have a lot of internal, we still do development work, but it's internal tooling to either do automation of stack analysis, fuzzing, or even just tools to assist with our own internal triage. So we're writing tools right now internally to do, how do we mass triage outdated software vulnerabilities and track that triage and work on it. So we have all these kind of things that we've identified where automation would help. So we still do development, but it's not production development. It's not product development. It's very focused on a lot of the tools for the team. So still do assessment work, threat modeling, bug bounty, all that good stuff. And that's been in like the AppSec bucket of work.
Okay. There was another question that came in just along those lines. What would be best guess for amount of effort spent on education for developers versus building the architecture for them to implement new features with security integrated? So I know you're not running the ProdSec team, but obviously you do a lot of developer outreach, developer, communication, so how much time is spent on that versus, hey, we're going to architect you a new feature rather than just having you like build it yourself?
I think they're kind of two separate. I don't want to say they're two separate, but there's two answers to the same question, right? Or it's the same end goal, right? Is not introduce vulnerabilities. I think it's a question of, can you actually implement, a service or an API or a library that would prevent, architecturally prevent this? If not, like, let's educate developers on the sharp edges of these APIs, document them, make sure we're covering them. We have knowledge on the team of, here are the things in our own review that we need to identify, but then also make that, it's everything lives on GitHub. So nothing's kind of siloed away to the, AppSec secret sauce. So we want to also provide those guidelines. And let's say we do a threat model of something and we're like, oh, we see you're introducing a new API endpoint. Like, here is our guidance, right? Our documentation around things you need to consider, either from our perspective to look into kind of globally as a threat model, or even specifics like I'm in, this kind of tricky API, what sort of things do I need to consider? So a lot of our education efforts have been kind of, I think for the most part, very informal. And we're making kind of progress to formalize that more and more. But we've kind of realized just with our resources and bandwidth, like sitting down and saying like, we're making a course on X, right, is really hard to schedule and do. We've done some internal, and this lands on the AppSec team. We've done, Ken actually has been working on kind of these internal, right, like brown bags. So we have a 45-minute, training session where, there's a specific area of concern or one of these sharp edges, or maybe we've had some, recurring, vulnerabilities in either through internal assessment or the bug bounty program, presenting that topic, for whoever can attend, keeping that collateral around. And then when we run into it or we do a threat model or developers thinking about something, they can say like, oh, I remember, there was some brown bag about, specific authorization issues around this stuff, and giving something for people to reference back to. And that's really, I think, for any training we've done, we always try to create some sort of collateral, some sort of reference that can be called back to, because I think having people in a room is a great way to, I guess, get initial excitement, get initial awareness of things. But that's not when the developer is sitting down and writing code. And even if they can think of like, oh, I kind of remember something about this, having some detailed documentation they can dive into, and that documentation also to be very explicit about the gaps, saying like, oh, hey, here's the generic cases. If there's something else there that you're unsure about, just reach out to the AppSec team, right? Another callback to, it's like kind of the fail safe of any documentation, right? Is like, here's some stuff we could think of, but worst case scenario, come talk to us and we'll have a conversation about it.
Well, and that goes back to like earlier in this conversation, we were discussing, having developers, right, building in the security protections architecturally, but for instance, overridden methods that are secure, or methods, I don't remember the exact name of one of them. I think one of them is like safe link to or something. And then so you've got developers who, built that to be safe and then referenced in the documentation. So for other developers, so it's kind of like a full circle.
Yeah, I think the other important part there too is kind of the static analysis and automation. So let's take like safe link to, or say we have like safe redirect to, right? So Rails has a redirect to method. You give it a URL and it'll happily redirect you to wherever. So we're like, okay, well, this seems like a good API to try to harden to make it harder to introduce open redirects. So we wrote a new helper method. I don't think it's in Rails proper, safe redirect to. And what that does is we have a list of whitelisted URLs that you can redirect to. So GitHub properties and things like that. And everything else you have to explicitly state like, no, allow this domain. So we can now say, all right, everyone should be using safe redirect to. There shouldn't really be any reason not to use it. The API is flexible enough to opt into special cases, and we can allow that. So now it's a matter of like, okay, well, we still have this redirect to API laying around here. We should. And so what we do is we then introduce automation that says, okay, anytime we see a pull request or a commit that introduces redirect to, we're going to comment on that and say, are you sure you want to use redirect to? Or you should basically say you shouldn't use redirect to. Check out our documentation here as to why that's a bad idea. And you should be using this new safer API with this calling convention to explicitly state if you want offsite redirects. So we've kind of gone, again, like Ken mentioned, kind of full circle of doing the architecture work to make a safer API, educating developers even during the development workflow of like, you just did this, this could lead to a vulnerability. Maybe it doesn't, right? It could be completely safe. It could be a static URL, but in the end, like use a safer API, whitelist that URL, and everyone's going to be happy. We don't even have to get involved at that point, right? Our bot goes out and makes these comments, right? And if everything's straightforward and we don't get down to the else clause of ask AppSec, then we don't even have to be involved in these discussions, and developers can kind of self-service to the documentation and gain awareness of these APIs that maybe they weren't aware of when they were writing this code.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of that, it sounds like there is a lot of automation around kind of the build process as well, whether it's regexes or, hey, I mean, obviously Brakeman's, does some stuff, but you're searching for other things as well. Like the raw instances, I know it pulls that out, but the redirect stuff, you're kind of creating these anti-patterns of, hey, this is bad, so I'm going to do a GitHub issue and comment on it and let the developers know, so you don't involve your team until you absolutely have to. That's kind of the impression that I'm getting, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, just kind of so basically what we do is we scan. So anytime a new pull request is open, we use pull requests for all of our workflows to commit code. And commits are added, pushed to that pull request. We look at the new code being modified or added, right? And yeah, we run Brakeman across, like, here's the previous report of Brakeman, here's the current report of Brakeman, what are the new findings? Was that, that must have been introduced in one of these lines of code. And we'll comment directly on the pull request. So it's right in kind of the developer workflow. And, if it kind of the same as if we were doing a manual review, right? We would be sitting down looking at the pull request, right? Adding a review to that and adding a comment on the pull request. So our automation is doing the same thing. So it follows kind of the same workflows that, people don't have to now get a failed CI job, log into some other tool, or download a Brakeman report, parse through the Brakeman report and see what's new and see what's been added and what we're actually talking about, right? Here, CI failed, why, right? And it's more very targeted to, you introduce this line of code, here's our concerns about it. There's some rules that we directly get CC'd in on, right? That we don't want to have be, self-service, right? You're changing the content security policy. We get CC'd in on anytime the file that defines the content security policy gets modified, because we want to know about that, right? Developers might be adding a new host, just for completely, innocuous reasons, but it might have an impact as to what that host might be, where it might be. So that always kind of needs our review. So we have kind of just different ranges of how we get, how worried we are, how involved we want to be in when we do this alerting in the kind of in the development process.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, it keeps going back to the fact I feel like, okay, as a consultant, I walk into places, and I mean, you did this at New Hapsis as well. And it's just always man, what is what's the biggest effect that I can have to actually help secure this application? And you guys are definitely on the builder side of that, right? You're able to actually see the whole process, the CI/CD pipeline. That's something that I don't get into a lot of the time because it's more that assessment side. I'm just looking at it after it comes out the end, and like being able to affect that change on a larger level is awesome. But then I also think about the larger institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Great. You guys are Rails focused. It's very easy to concentrate and build new APIs around the one large framework that you're targeting. But a lot of those like fintech organizations, right? You've got everything from Rails to Go to Node to the old Java and .NET applications. And it becomes a much more difficult or a much more complicated process to build something like that.
So that's like one thing we're actually, part of like our growing pains current state, right? Is we're no longer a Ruby on Rails shop, right? We are very much, current day GitHub is all over the board from, we have a lot of Node apps, we have a lot of Go apps. So we're, not only have to build, for some of us who've been at the company for almost 6 years, like, well, I gotta start learning Go. I have to, and not only building our own skill sets, but along with that, building the same amount of guidance that we have for, the monolith for Ruby on Rails, same amount of automation. So that's like actually one of our near-term goals is like, okay, let's find a couple languages and frameworks that, we see have, high penetration at GitHub and start building those same resources for those frameworks and languages. And even as things move towards a more kind of, service-oriented architecture where we have microservices and, our monoliths calling out to things like what new internal features, architecturally, do we need to start introducing to allow those new services to be built, secure by default and with all of the same, all the same consideration as, a new feature or new code that's being added to the monolith. So it's definitely a point at, we're not quite at the point yet where there's a little bit of everything everywhere. We're still in the process of building that, that landscape, but hopefully along the way, we can do the same sort of work that we did for Ruby on Rails, but for these other frameworks, and offer the same guidance for those apps as we could, for our monolith.
Yeah, I always go back to the Netflix model of building out their happy path, right? I mean, I know they talk about it realistically in the context of like their AWS instances. Like, this is how you go deploy an application in AWS, and this is how you do it securely. Mm-hmm. But realistically, what you guys are doing is, hey, from a code perspective, we're doing the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. You go do X, Y, and Z, and you will never hear from us, right? Because mm-hmm. we already know that that's secure. We've built this stuff for you. We've looked at it. If you do it in the right way, guess what? Go and do whatever you want to do. Mm-hmm. But it's always hard to support that across multiple languages because, I mean, your staff has to scale. That's right. Realistically what happens, right?
Yeah.
Your expertise. So, but, well, Greg, we've been going for over an hour, which is crazy to me, right? But this is how it always goes. We have this problem every single week.
Every time. It feels like we just started. And it's,
well, it's a good problem to have, right? Better than the awkward silence otherwise.
The awkward sign. I mean, we could build some of that in if we, just sit here and stare at each other, see how people like it. Maybe, and viewership goes up. Right?
Nice.
Yeah, but speaking of which, awkward silence. And so, I'm trying to think if there's any like last minute questions that I wanted to get in there, but it feels like we've talked about quite a bit. Recommendations, right? Like maybe that's it. Like if there's a couple points that you could recommend to the viewers as far as like either starting a program or even getting into the industry, what would those be?
Yeah, I think getting in an industry, I think is kind of like, I think for my story, I think it's a little, I don't know, I don't want to say lucked into it, but just kind of naturally went that way. I think what we're seeing a lot though is the resources, kind of like I mentioned with coursework and curriculum, get into those, courses, see if application security is an area that is interesting. I think also though, just the prevalence of bug bounty programs really has opened the door for people to do this work, get recognized for this work, and obviously do this work in a kind of way you can put on your resume instead of bragging to your friends on IRC. So I think there's a bit of that. It's a great area to get into, I would say. If I was getting in this field, even in a separate job or maybe in an engineering role, look into bug bounty programs, see what you can learn and work there, and also within as an engineer, how in your company can you start focusing on security work? If you're already doing engineering work, could you even if there's not a formalized security champion role, is that kind of responsibility you could add to the work you do to start focusing in that area. And then recommendations for people kind of starting off, I would say start thinking about kind of those foundational things, right? And it's like, look at your apps, look at your app or look at your apps, right? And say like, okay, this is 2019 of this app. What is this going to look like in 5 years? Assuming everything goes well, this app will be alive and continuing growing in 5 years. And thinking about what foundational things could be started, could be introduced to allow that to grow in a way that's just not, completely unchecked, but how can you make things securable as they grow and develop? And I think it is part of that, writing those APIs, figuring out, what are developers stumbling with security-wise when they're introducing new features, and how can you give them confidence and just make it easier to make the right security decisions. I think that's, I don't know, some of the recommendations there.
No, that's all good, right? I mean, we've talked about bug bounties quite a bit and, some of the other stuff. So, but it's always good to have a different perspective on that and where that actually fits. And And even what do you do inside of an organization? Everybody's always asking, because everybody's building a program at some point, right? They may be in a different phase of the SDLC, but they're involved with it somehow. So great. Greg, well, thank you for coming on.
Plug too. We are hiring on the team.
Okay.
So we have a position open. I'll just drop that link there on the chat if anyone's interested. A little bit of promotion, but it's
of course
a team doing AppSec work. So
so if anyone wants to join the AppSec Fantasy Land, talk to Greg, right?
Or see how much of a fantasy land maybe it's not.
Yeah, exactly. It's only from the outside,
Right.
Yeah.
Where did you post the link there, Greg?
I dropped it in the chat on the YouTube video.
Okay.
I'm new to this YouTube thing, so yeah.
What is YouTube? I didn't.
We'll make sure. Yeah, we'll make sure it drops in there.
Cool.
Before we wrap up, we'll make sure it's associated with the.
Here we go.
The episode. But yeah, we appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's great talking with you guys, and
yeah. Hopefully, we can do it again. I don't even know, Ken. Next week.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure yet. Let me pull that up because and by the way, by the way, next week's Tim Tomes. Awesome. So maybe we'll hear a little bit about
CSP.
Kevin Cody's cores attacking cores talk, I think.
Yep.
And maybe some updates on what's going on with Recon NG. That should be good. And as you said, we've got training in late May and OWASP EU, which Tel Aviv is not necessarily EU, but okay, that's where it's at. Which I'm good with. Whatever, sounds cool. And let's see, LocoMocoSec, I'll be at not next week, the week after. And Greg, are you going to be at any conferences? Usually we like to, if you're going to be somewhere, we like to tell people where you're going to be. That way they can stalk you and follow you around and make it real weird.
No conference. I don't know. I'm not going to make it out to LocoMocoSec. Now I'm feeling like I'm missing out now by not doing that one again this year. Great conference, but I'll miss Hawaii, but wasn't able to. This year I would have had to do a family vacation too, and we just couldn't get it scheduled. So there's no way I was going out there without bringing the family along. So it's a great conference though.
Yeah. No, I got away with it last year, but not this year. So not having it. So especially when I posted that picture of where we were working at on the on the water, it's like a 360 view of like this beautiful water and beach and so
best conference room ever.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like a legit coffee shop down below too, so it's pretty good. I was happy. Ocean and coffee. So
yep.
Cool. Well, they'll find you online then. We've posted your Twitter account and everything, but I won't be at LocoMocoSec either, so I got that whole fear of missing out stuff going on, but
off Twitter,
family and life, right? So. Cool. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you all next week.
And don't drop off quite yet, Greg. All right. Bye, everyone.